4 pennies. It was both a fortune and nothing at all. In the palm of her hand, the copper coins were warm from her nervous grip, each one a small, heavy sun promising the impossible. For 18-year-old Lin Jing, standing in the dusty air of Abernathy's Mercantile in Granite Creek, Nevada, 1871, those 4 cents were the last barrier between her father's hunger and the loaf of bread sitting on the counter. The bread cost 5. The proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched from smelling something unpleasant, watched her with watery, impatient eyes. The smell of sawdust, cured meat, and raw flour hung thick in the summer heat, a constant reminder of the abundance that was just 1 penny out of her reach. Jing had lived in Granite Creek for 2 years, ever since the railroad crews had moved on, leaving behind a smattering of Chinese families in their wake. She had learned that in this town a person's worth was counted in coin and measured by the color of their skin, and she was found wanting on both accounts. "Well?" Abernathy's voice was as dry as the dirt street outside. "Are you buying something or just warming my air?" Jing swallowed, the motion tight in her throat. She had practiced the words, but they caught behind her teeth. She gestured to the loaf, its crust a beautiful burnished gold. "Please, sir, the bread." She pushed the 4 pennies across the worn wooden counter. They made a pathetic, tinny sound. Abernathy didn't even look at them. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn but clean clothes, her dark hair pulled back severely, and the quiet desperation in her eyes. "The sign says 5 cents, he stated, as if speaking to a child who couldn't read. "It said 5 cents for a year. You got 5 cents? "I have 4, she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "My father, he is sick." "I will bring the other penny tomorrow, I promise." Abernathy gave a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "Promises don't pay my suppliers. The price is 5 cents. Come back when you have it." He turned his attention to a ledger, dismissing her completely. The finality of the gesture was like a physical blow. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at her eyes. She knew better than to argue. To argue was to draw attention, and attention was always dangerous. She was about to scoop her pennies back into her hand when a shadow fell over the counter. It was a large shadow, one that seemed to swallow the light from the dusty windows. Jing flinched, expecting trouble, and slowly looked up. The man was enormous. He wasn't just tall, he was built on the scale of the mountains he clearly came from. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of his buckskin shirt, and his hands, resting on the counter, were calloused and looked strong enough to split logs. A thick, dark beard, untrimmed but clean, covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was just as long, tied back with a leather thong. He smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and clean earth. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were fixed on Abernathy. Jedediah Stone rarely came down from his claim in the Sierras. He preferred the company of granite and ponderosa pines to that of men. But when his supplies ran low, he had to endure the noise and suspicion of Granite Creek. He had been standing in the back of the store, looking for blasting powder, when he saw the girl. He had seen the quiet dignity in her posture and the careful way she counted her coins, and he had seen the casual cruelty in Abernathy's dismissal. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into a leather pouch at his belt, pulled out a silver dime, and placed it on the counter next to Jing's 4 pennies. The sound of the silver coin hitting the wood was solid, definitive. Abernathy's head snapped up. His dismissive scowl melted into a practiced, greasy smile when he saw who it was. Jedediah Stone didn't spend much, but when he did, he paid in silver and gold dust, and he never haggled. "Mr. Stone, good to see you. What can I get for you today?" Abernathy asked, his tone now slick with deference. Jed ignored him. He looked at Jing, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "For the bread," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep in the earth. "And a sack of flour, and some bacon, and beans." He continued to list items: salt, sugar, coffee, dried apples, his gaze never leaving the storekeeper, who began to hustle, piling the goods on the counter. Jing was frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never been the recipient of such a public act of kindness, especially not from a white man, and certainly not one who looked as wild and imposing as the man beside her. She didn't know the custom for this. She didn't know if she should thank him, or run, or simply pretend it wasn't happening. When the pile of supplies was complete, Jed pushed it all gently toward her. "This should last a while," he said, his voice softer now. He then looked at Abernathy. "Put it on my account." He scooped up Jing's 4 pennies and pressed them back into her hand, closing her fingers around them. "You keep this. A person ought to have something left over." He turned to leave, his business apparently concluded. The decision had been made, the consequence yet to land. For Jing, it was a miracle. For Jed, it was simply the right thing to do. But in a town like Granite Creek, no good deed went unpunished, and the eyes watching from the shadows of the mercantile had taken note. Jedediah had intended to simply pay for the girl's supplies and be on his way, but the defiant set of her jaw as she hoisted the heavy flour sack told him she wouldn't accept the charity without carrying her share. He took the heaviest items without a word, leaving her with the bread and a smaller parcel, and followed her out into the blistering sun of the main street. The confrontation in the store had drawn stares, and now those stares followed them. 2 young men who often loitered near the saloon, the Miller brothers, watched them pass with undisguised contempt. One of them, Billy Miller, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Jing's feet. Jed stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a bear considering a threat. He said nothing, but his blue eyes settled on Billy, and the easy smirk on the young man's face faltered. Billy's brother nudged him, and they both shuffled back into the shade of the saloon's porch. The moment was small, but it was a clear declaration. The girl was with him. Jing had seen the exchange, and a tremor of fear went through her. She knew the Millers. Their father, Landencroft, had changed his name when he bought the land office, but everyone knew he ran the town through debt and intimidation. His sons acted as his enforcers, entitled and cruel. To earn their ire was to invite disaster. "You should not have," she said quietly, her eyes on the dusty path ahead. They were walking toward the collection of shacks and lean-tos by the creek bed where the Chinese families lived. "You will make trouble for yourself." "Trouble finds me whether I look for it or not," Jed rumbled. "Seemed to me that trouble was finding you just fine on its own. A little company can't hurt." They walked in silence for a few more minutes. The respectable part of Granite Creek, with its false-fronted buildings and boardwalks, gave way to rutted tracks and hard-packed earth. Jing's home was a small, clapboard shack, leaning slightly, as if tired, but the area around it was swept clean, and a few determined-looking herbs grew in a tin bucket by the door. It was a place of deep poverty, but also of deep pride. As they reached the door, it opened, and an old man stood there, leaning heavily on the frame. He was thin, his face a web of deep lines, and a racking cough shook his frail body. This was her father, Lin Wei. His eyes, clouded with sickness, widened slightly at the sight of the giant mountain man standing beside his daughter, his arms laden with food. Jed's gaze softened as he took in the scene. The sick father, the clean but bare room visible behind him, the girl standing straight and proud despite it all. He understood. This wasn't just about a loaf of bread. This was about survival. He stepped inside, placing the sacks of flour and beans on the floor. The room was tiny, containing only 2 cots, a small table, and a cold cook stove. But like the yard, it was immaculate. Jean spoke to her father in rapid, quiet Cantonese, her words a mix of explanation and reassurance. The old man watched Jed with a wary but intelligent gaze. He had seen enough of the world to know that kindness from a stranger, especially one of this size and type, was a rare and often complicated thing. Jed nodded respectfully to the old man. "Jedediah Stone, sir. Your daughter is a strong woman." Lin Wei did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He gave a slight formal bow of his head. Jing translated, and a flicker of pride crossed her father's face. Suddenly, the shack's doorway was filled again, this time not by a welcome shadow, but by 2 menacing figures. The Miller brothers stood there, blocking the light. Billy had a smug, ugly look on his face. "Well, well," Billy sneered, his eyes roving over the supplies on the floor. "Looks like the little bird found a big protector. Our pa heard about the commotion in town. He don't like folks stirring up charity cases. Makes people get ideas." Jed moved to place himself between the brothers and Jing and her father. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply became a wall of muscle and buckskin. "This is a private home. You're not welcome here. Leave." "Our pa owns this land," the other brother Frank said, puffing out his chest. "He owns this shack. He can have you thrown off it by sundown if he takes a mind to it. Maybe you ought to remember who you're talking to." This was the crisis. It had escalated from a store counter to a public street, and now to a direct threat of homelessness. Jed knew he could break both young men with his bare hands, but that would only bring a worse violence down on this family. He had to be smarter. He had to use the rules of this town against them. "Your pa might own the land," Jed said, his voice dangerously calm, "but the law says he can't just throw a sick man out without notice. And a U.S. Marshal just happens to be in Virginia City. I'm sure he'd be very interested in Mr. Croft's business practices, especially concerning the Homestead Act and territorial claims. Telegraphs work fast these days." He was bluffing, mostly. He had no idea if a marshal was in Virginia City, but he knew men like Landon Croft, who operated on the edge of the law, feared federal attention more than anything. The brothers exchanged an uncertain look. They were bullies, not strategists. The mention of marshals and territorial law was beyond their understanding, but it sounded official and threatening. "This ain't over," Billy spat, but the threat was hollow. They backed away from the door, defeated for the moment. The immediate conflict was resolved, but Jed knew he had just kicked a hornet's nest. He had publicly defied Landon Croft and used the threat of the law against his sons. He had bought a young woman a loaf of bread, but he was about to find out that the real price of that kindness in Granite Creek was a war with the man who owned it. After the Miller brothers had gone, a heavy silence settled in the small shack. The afternoon sun streamed through the single grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the pile of provisions on the floor, a bounty that now felt less like a gift and more like the opening move in a dangerous game. Lin Wei had another fit of coughing, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to tear at his thin chest. Jing rushed to his side, helping him sit on his cot and offering him a cup of water. Jed stood by the door, feeling like an intruder in their quiet world of hardship. He had brought this trouble to their doorstep. He had meant to help, but instead he had painted a target on them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with a feeling he couldn't name. "I didn't aim to bring them down on you." Jing looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. There was no blame in them, only a weary resignation. "They would have come sooner or later. Mr. Croft wants this land cleared. He says our homes are an eyesore. You're standing up for me, It only gave them an excuse. She turned her attention back to her father, wiping his brow with a damp cloth. Jed watched her hands. They were small but capable, moving with a gentle efficiency that spoke of long practice in the art of caring for someone. He saw a worn piece of paper on the small table next to the cot. It was a letter, the creases soft and deep from countless readings, the Chinese characters elegant and faded. It was a tether to a life they had left behind. "He was a scholar in our village," Jing said softly, noticing his gaze. "He taught the children. Here, he laid track for the railroad until a blasting accident broke his body." She didn't say it with pity, but as a simple statement of fact. This was the life they had been given. "They paid him off with $50 and a paper that says he owes the company store $70. So we are trapped." Here was the hidden truth of their poverty. It was not misfortune. It was a cage built of paper and ink, locked by prejudice. Jed felt a slow burn of anger in his chest. He had spent his life in the mountains, where the rules were simple. You respected the weather, the animals, and the seasons. A man's word was his bond, and strength was for building and protecting, not for preying on the weak. The world of ledgers and deeds and company scrip felt like a sickness. "Why do you help us?" Jean asked, her voice quiet but direct. She had stood up from the cot and was now facing him. "You do not know us." Jed looked away, his gaze falling on the rough-hewn walls of the shack. He wasn't a man who spoke of his past. The memories were a private country, full of ghosts. But her question demanded an honest answer. "I had a wife," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "And a daughter. We had a small homestead back in the Oregon Territory. Fever came through one winter. There was no doctor. I was not there. I was up in the hills, trapping. By the time I got back," he didn't need to finish. The silence in the room finished it for him. "I couldn't stay there, so I came here, to the mountains. It's quieter." He finally looked at her. "I know what it is to watch someone you love fade away and not be able to do a damn thing about it. No one should have to face that alone." In that moment, the vast space between them, of culture, of experience, of physical size, shrank to nothing. She saw not a fearsome mountain man, but a man hollowed out by a grief he had carried alone for years. He saw not a fragile immigrant girl, but a woman with a spine of steel, holding her world together with sheer will. It was an admission of vulnerability that reframed everything. His kindness wasn't random charity. It was an attempt to guard a stranger's fire because his own had gone out. Their quiet understanding was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats and angry voices outside. It was not the Miller boys this time. It was their father. Landon Croft sat on a fine-looking bay horse flanked by 4 hired men, all of them carrying rifles. Croft was a man in his 50s, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in the dusty squalor of the creek side. His face was clean-shaven and handsome in a severe way, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "Stone!" Croft's voice was accustomed to command. "Get out here. Your business is with me, not with these squatters." Jed stepped out of the shack, moving to block the doorway once more. Jing stood behind him, her hand gripping the doorframe. "These people are on my property, illegally," Croft declared, his voice carrying for all the neighbors to hear. A few faces peered from behind curtains in the nearby shacks. "I have a deed, registered and filed with the Territorial Land Office. I'm giving them 1 hour to vacate. After that, my men will tear this shack down." He held up a rolled document. A deed. The legal instrument of his power. "You can't," Judd said, his voice low and steady. "The man is sick. It's inhumane." Croft smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "The law is not concerned with humanity, Mr. Stone. It is concerned with property, and this is my property. Now, you can walk away and go back to your rocks and your trees, or you can stay here and be arrested for trespassing and inciting a public disturbance. It's your choice." This was the escalating threat. It was no longer just intimidation. It was a legal public ultimatum backed by armed men. There was no U.S. Marshal to call, no bluff that would work a second time. Jed had a choice to make, and it was a choice that would cost him something he could not get back. He could retreat to the solitude of his mountain, to the safety of being forgotten, or he could stay. He could make this family's fight his own, and in doing so, become a permanent enemy of the most powerful man for 100 miles. He looked back over his shoulder at Jing. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on him, not with a plea for rescue, but with a quiet, shared defiance. In her gaze, he saw the echo of the family he had lost, and the chance to answer for the one thing he could never forgive himself for, not being there when it mattered. He turned back to face Landon Croft. He planted his feet in the dirt in front of the small, leaning shack. "I reckon I'll stay," Jedediah Stone said, and with those words he chose his ground. By the time the first autumn chill settled in the Sierras, the small shack by Granite Creek looked different. It no longer leaned. Jedediah Stone, with his immense strength and surprising skill, had reinforced the frame, patched the roof with new timber he'd brought down from the mountain, and built a sturdy stone chimney for the cook stove. The pile of firewood stacked against the outer wall was as tall as he was, a bulwark against the coming winter. His decision to stay had not led to the immediate violence Croft had threatened. Jed's quiet, immovable presence, combined with the whispers of his bluff about the U.S. Marshal, had given Croft pause. A public, bloody eviction of a sick man defended by a popular, if reclusive, frontiersman was bad for business. Croft dealt in the slow strangulation of debt and legal maneuvering, not open warfare. He retreated, content to let the coming winter do his work for him. He was certain they would starve or freeze. He had underestimated Jedediah Stone, and he had underestimated Lin Jing. The partnership that formed between the mountain man and the young woman was one of a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Jed would disappear into the mountains for days at a time, returning with his mule laden with fresh venison, rabbits, and herbs he knew would ease Lin Wei's cough. Jing, in turn, would take the meat he provided and stretch it into meals that lasted for days. Her skill in the kitchen, a quiet magic. She tended to her father, whose health, bolstered by consistent food and medicine, began to slowly improve. She washed Jed's buckskins and mended tears with tiny, perfect stitches. He protected their home. She made it a place worth protecting. The town watched. At first the whispers were cruel, but as the weeks turned into months, the narrative began to shift. They saw Jed not as a wild hermit, but as a man of principle. They saw Jing not as a destitute squatter, but as a woman of immense fortitude. Mr. Abernathy, in the Mercantile, started greeting Jing with a nod. Other merchants, long cowed by Croft, would slip an extra apple or a handful of beans into her basket. The community's judgment, once a hostile wall, was slowly becoming a foundation. The stalemate with Croft was broken not by a gun, but by a piece of paper. One afternoon, while sorting through his meager belongings, Lin Wei found the original compensation document from the railroad. Tucked inside was a surveyor's map from 1869, marking the railroad's right-of-way. Jed, looking it over, saw something no one else had noticed. The creek bed where the Chinese shacks had been built was, according to the official survey, a few crucial yards inside the railroad's land grant, not on the parcel Croft had later purchased. Croft's deed, the source of all his power over them, was fraudulent. He had been threatening them with a title he did not legally possess. Jed didn't confront Croft publicly. That would lead to a protracted legal battle they couldn't afford. Instead, he rode to the telegraph office and sent a message to the Central Pacific land agent in Sacramento. He simply stated that a Mr. Landon Croft of Granite Creek was claiming ownership of railroad land and threatening to forcibly evict former railroad employees living on it. He knew a corporation as powerful as the railroad would defend its property rights with a vengeance. 2 weeks later, a well-dressed man from the railroad arrived in town. He had a brief, closed-door meeting with Landon Croft. No one knew what was said, but when Croft emerged, his face was pale with fury. The next day, Lin Jing and the other 5 Chinese families living by the creek were issued papers granting them lifetime leases on their plots for the sum of $1 a year payable to the Central Pacific Railroad. Croft's power over them was broken. 6 months after that first day in the mercantile, spring had come to the mountains. The snow was melting and the creek was running high and clear. Lin Jing stood once more at the counter of Abernathy's mercantile. Her father, while still frail, was now strong enough to sit outside in the sun. She placed a stack of supplies on the counter: flour, coffee, a bolt of sturdy blue cloth. When Mr. Abernathy tallied the cost, she did not pull out a handful of pennies. She placed a heavy, solid silver dollar on the worn wood. The sound it made was the opposite of the 4 pennies. It was a sound of sufficiency, of security. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice clear and steady. He met her eyes, and for the first time gave her a look of genuine respect. "You're welcome, miss," he said. When she stepped outside, Jed was there, leaning against a porch post, waiting for her. The sun caught in his dark hair, and he smiled as she approached, a rare, gentle expression that softened the hard lines of his face. He had traded his buckskins for a simple canvas shirt and trousers, looking less like a mountain spirit and more like a man who had found a place to belong. They didn't speak of love or the future. Their bond had been forged in shared work and mutual respect, something deeper and more solid than words. He took the heaviest parcel from her, and they started the walk home together, their steps falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. In a hard country, a person's worth wasn't measured by the gold in their pockets or the name they carried, but by the space they were willing to make for another. Jedediah Stone had come down from the mountain looking for supplies, and had found a reason to stay. Lin Jing had been searching for a single penny, and had found a home. And sometimes, in the dusty, unforgiving landscape of the West, that was more than enough.